So this lecture kind of begins our journey into microeconomics, which is all about how economists think about the firm, the individual firm, and the individual consumer operating. Now, microeconomics, of the two fields, microeconomics is the oldest. And really until late 1800s did macroeconomics really come um, into being, I guess. You know, what's interesting about it is, even though when we think of like Adam Smith, the father of modern economics, and his kind of seminal text, The Wealth of Nations in 1776, I mean, the nature of that book, by its very title, The Wealth of Nations, would seem to suggest that, the earliest focus was about macroeconomics. But again, in fact, the earliest economists, and this would be going back all the way to Aristotle, was about microeconomics. And there it's looking at, again, how individual consumers and how individual firms make optimal decisions. So with that kind of stage being set, here in chapter 6, we start looking at the firm. And so we're going to start here in 6 by just looking at the firm in general. And then in 7 and 8, we look at different types of competition, different ways that individual firms exist with each other. So what do we already know? What did we learn? Let me get the pen and tablet here. So what do we already know? We already knew that market efficiency occurs at the equilibrium point, and that at that equilibrium point, that the area of consumer surplus and producer surplus is maximized, and that the total welfare, which is this larger triangle, that entire triangle is maximized. And that another way of reading that would be is that there's no deadweight loss. Now, as it implies here, it doesn't imply that there's going to be any equity. So again, then we would have all those other debates about what's fair, who should get what. But what we see is that, at least from, especially from chapter 4 and chapter 5, was just how important prices are, especially to the microeconomist. In fact, if you end up liking this course, and you end up wanting to take more economics, you would have to take intermediate microeconomic theory. You could take it with me, just to keep your life equally dull. And we call intermediate microeconomics price theory, because for the microeconomist, prices are the signal that ensure that we reach efficiency. And as we saw, especially with chapter 5, generally speaking, economists do not like price controls. That would be, again, things like the minimum wage, things like a rent control. Basically, microeconomists and economists in general don't like price floors and price ceilings, despite how good they look. Right? It makes me look like a horrible person. If someone were to ask my opinion and I say I'm against the minimum wage, it looks like I'm like employing children or something worse. But if only to repeat myself. My two problems with the minimum wage would be, first, that the actual amount that's decided on for the minimum wage seems to be a random number. There doesn't seem to be any rhyme or reason as to why they pick what the federal minimum wage for the longest time was $7.25 an hour. That was just picked because it was a nice round number, right? Or we get attracted to, I'm sure if we looked on the web and was, well, let's just look at it. Why don't we just not talk about it theoretically? Why don't we look at it? I'm just going to type in how many states have a $15 minimum wage. 15 of them. Why is my question? Because it was a nice, easy, convenient round number. 15 states in Washington, D.C. Oh, sorry, $15 or higher. Sorry, I shouldn't have been so. I'm just trying to really quickly look here. I wanted to see how many exactly have 15. But even if we just look at this, so this is just a table of all of them. Arkansas, 11. California, 16.50. Here we go, $15, $13, $14, $15. Then you have a bunch at the federal minimum wage of $7.25. Here's my issue. My issue is that these just are randomly being determined. They have no connection to what it takes for a person to live at that kind of wage. Then the other problem I would have with the minimum wage, again, is in general, our loss of efficiency. But it can create unemployment for certain segments of the population. So with all that said, we now really just want to look specifically at how firms are doing what they do. How do we calculate their overall profit levels, and how do they determine their loss levels, and how do we decide how much firms will decide to produce? So the easiest thing to do first here would be to calculate just a general equation for profit. And that essentially, that total profit is equal to total revenue minus total cost. And that total revenue is simply the price times the quantity. That profits would then be positive, obviously, when the total revenue is greater than the total cost, and that we'd have a loss when the total revenue is less than the total cost. So already you can see here in the way that I broke down this equation, look at that. We're going to want to know how is the price determined, and we're going to want to know how is the quantity determined. Now, I don't like this class being about murder mysteries here. I'm just going to make this smaller here so the slide becomes bigger. Okay, I'll leave it like this and then I'll change it to the next one. The quantity is going to be determined by the point where the marginal revenue equals the marginal cost. And I'll talk more about why that is and what those terms even mean. But just keep that in mind, that to find how much is going to be produced, it's going to be where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. And for the price, it's going to be determined on the type of competition, which is the whole point of chapter 7 and 8, where we look at various forms of competition. So this is how all three of these chapters connect with one another. Right? This is setting the stage for all three chapters by just saying firms want to maximize profit. That's their ultimate goal. And so if you're trying to maximize profit, then we would need to know how is profit calculated. That's calculated by total revenue minus total cost. And that if that number is positive, that would mean that the revenue is greater than the cost, which would mean obviously positive profit. And if the costs are greater than the revenue, then we have a loss. We have a negative number. And it's simply what we need to do to calculate the total revenue is take price times the quantity, The price will be determined by the nature of the competition between the firms, and the quantity will be determined by the point where the marginal revenue is equal to the marginal cost. Okay, so here's a simple kind of example. You can kind of see the maths involved here. If we take the price times quantity, we get our revenue. And then let's say that I told you that the total costs are $2,000. Then with a revenue equaling 2250, then 2250 minus 2,000 would leave me with $250 left. If my cost instead had been greater, then I would have had a negative number, which would have been a loss. Now, we need to break down these costs into two types: explicit costs and implicit costs. Think of it this way. Explicit costs are anything that have a receipt. Isn't that what you kids say these days? Receipts, show me the receipt. Anything that you could figure out would have a receipt. Wages, right? You'd get a paycheck and it'd be like a paycheck form. You'd see the money coming out of your bank account, paying for insurance, paying for food ingredients, bills that must be paid. There's receipts, there are invoices. Now, the thing is that these are not the only costs that economists think about, though, because economists also have what are called implicit costs, which are sometimes things that people forget about. And implicit costs are the opportunity costs. And essentially, it's looking at what you could have done instead. Right? So, in fact, for going to college, your biggest cost isn't your tuition costs. It's obviously what, the fact that you're not earning all that extra pay at work. Right? You could, even if you're working right now, you could be working more hours if you weren't going to school. Those foregone wages, that ends up being, those implicit costs end up being the biggest cost of going to college. And you'll see when you get to the homework and whatnot that you'll be presented with some examples where you have to look at, deciding what's an explicit cost versus an implicit cost. But again, if you can think of it as having an invoice, think of it as generating a receipt, then it's most likely an explicit cost. Total cost would then be my explicit costs plus my implicit costs. So again, going back to that equation of profit, which I'm just writing as pi, that profit equals total revenue minus total cost. If total revenue is price times quantity, one way, only one way here, there's other ways though, one way of looking at total costs would be adding up your explicit costs plus your implicit costs. So if you were to add these two up and subtract them from your total revenue, you'd get your profit. But that's not the only way you can calculate costs. In fact, most of the time when economists are thinking about costs, what we're doing is we're thinking about it in terms of variable costs and fixed costs. What makes something fixed versus making it variable is whether it changes with the quantity of production. And if it does, well, then that would be the point where we would think it's a variable cost. And for something like a building is typically a fixed cost because no matter how much or how little activity is occurring there, if it doesn't change, then then it's just a situation where um, it's a fixed cost. If it's changing with the quantity, then you're looking at an implicit cost, which is also most likely a variable cost. Something that changes with your quantity of activity. So like a perfect example would be something like electricity, or even your labor costs. And so you'll also see this in the homework as well as in the quiz. You'll see this you'll be needing to make these distinctions between these variable and these fixed costs. Again, you can see here with the variable costs, those would all be things that change with the level of activity, with the level of production. Whereas the fixed costs, right? For instance, I'm on a salary. I got no reason for there to be more students here or more students or fewer students. I get paid the same amount, whether there's lots of kids in the class or there are none. So a salary would be like that. A wage, though, that's a little bit of a tough one. But a wage would also be like a commission, which would also be like, again, varying with the amount of quantity of production. Now, once we calculate this profit, we also want to think about what did we consider for the costs. If we considered all of the costs, both the explicit and the implicit costs, then we would have calculated what's called the economic profit. And this would be what economists probably would care about a great deal because, again, they're taking into account these opportunity costs of doing the activity. Otherwise, if we're only looking at invoices, we're only looking at receipts and invoices, then you're simply calculating the accounting profit. Now, as I already gave you the preview of this, we want to know, again, that if total revenue is equal to price times the quantity, we want to know how quantity is determined. That quantity is determined by the point where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. And that's what you see right here. So the answer to the question of how much a firm should produce is determined by where we think those marginal revenue and marginal cost points are. And what we can see is that, when we look at this idea of the production process, is that basically, we think of the production of anything as the combination of little things that, become a bigger thing. And so these would be things like, the big things for economists, the three big inputs would be land, labor, and capital. And so with this land, labor, and capital, so land would be anything on top of the land, anything underneath the land. So natural resources like oil, wood, all those things would all be part of land. Capital for economists is buildings, machines. And then labor, well, that's like me and you, right? Not only the number of people working, but the quality of their labor as well. And there's a reason why this is black. Economists like to call this the black box. And the reason why is because this is where technology exists. Technology for an economist is the notion of how inputs are combined. We're not just talking about like computers and programs and the physical ways that we think of technology today. Rather, technology can just be a process, a habit. And so technology is the way in which we combine the land, labor, and capital together in order to produce a final product. And so we get a production function. That production function would look something like this. Don't get all weirded out here. The quantity of production would be a function of the amount of capital and the amount of labor, these inputs. So the output is a function of your inputs. Why is it a function? Well, because that's the production process. The technology. So the technology is combining the inputs to make an output. And as it says right here, that production function then is describing the relationship between the inputs and the outputs. Meaning, for instance, if you were to take intermediate microeconomics with me, which by the way, I'm teaching in the fall, you could take it with me as early as in a few weeks here. You could see me in person twice a week on, I think the class is on Tuesdays and Thursdays in the early afternoon. I know what you're saying. You've already made your schedule. You don't want to, things are set. But if you find this class really cool, take the class with me. Even if it's full, send me an email. I will make sure you get into class. But the way an economist would look at this then is we'd say that the quantity of production, let's say, is 3k squared L cubed. Right? So this would show me that if I changed my amount of capital by 1, so let's say I got 1 more machine, or let's say I even got 2 more machines, what would happen to the output? It'd go up by a factor of 4, right? 2 squared is 4. So the quantity would go up by 4. There's where are we seeing the technology here? We're seeing the technology in that constant term, and we're seeing it in these exponents. And what we're seeing as well is that in this production function, we see that some of the inputs can change pretty quickly, and some of them perhaps don't change, meaning that we have some inputs that are variable, and we have some inputs that are fixed. And so to get at this idea of what is a marginal, when you see the word marginal, you should think of it as the same as the word additional. So if I'm looking at what we would call here the marginal product of labor, what we're saying is how much additional product do we get when we add 1 more worker? So the worker here would be the variable input. And essentially what we want to say, it's again this equation MP subscript L. The marginal product of labor would be how much additional product do we produce when we add 1 more worker. So you can kind of see that here with this chart, right? So when I go first, when I have 0 workers, I don't produce anything. So we're saying here that in this production function, which again is a function of capital and labor, is that if this is 0, whatever the rest of the numbers are, because it's multiplicative, meaning multiplication, if you multiply it by 0, it's undefined here. Right, so we're not going to produce anything. Once you get one worker, now I'm producing 5. And when I go from 1 to 2, so when I have a change in my labor by 1, the change in my output is 10, right? Because I'm going from 5 to 15. That right there is my marginal product of labor. So my marginal product of labor would be how much more I produce based on how many more workers I have, which in this case would be 10 over 1, which is 10. Right? Because I went from 0 to 1, I went from 0 to 5, so that was 5. 15 to 30, 15. And so what you'll notice here is that the marginal product of labor is initially increasing and then decreasing. Increasing and then decreasing. This was essentially something not discovered by, but basically talked about in that book I started this lecture off with, which was, The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith. The thing that he discovered is what makes countries rich is that they encourage, they allow for workers to specialize in the production of things. And as they specialize, they become better producers. And then you get to a point where these workers, the 5th worker, the 6th worker, the 7th worker, they're still adding additional output, just not as much. And by your 9th or 10th worker, these workers are making the process less effective. I don't know, they're stealing, joking around, slowing everybody else down. That's when an organization is basically too big. So here's the equation. I kind of already told you this, but you essentially could do the same thing then for the capital as well as the labor. And this is just another way of looking at it. Number of workers, amount of meals produced. Eventually, that marginal product will diminish, meaning that it still has a positive sign, but that the magnitude of that number, the size of that number, is getting smaller. Again, we saw that here after with the third unit to the 8th unit. That was all diminishing marginal product of labor. Or basically this region right here, where it's still positive, but it's downward sloping. This would be negative marginal product of labor, which is different than this, which is positive, but getting smaller. And this, which is positive and getting larger. Now, at the same time as our labor was our variable input here, we also had, again, our fixed input. That fixed input was our capital in this case. And so essentially, the reason why these workers are eventually becoming less and less productive is essentially they're becoming like crowded. The quote that we see here on the slide is too many cooks in the kitchen. So for instance, the best example I have is even here at Manoa, we have just for our department of 20 people, we have one big photocopier. So if I know I have to photocopy an exam, I need to basically do it when others aren't photocopying their exams. Right, so I got to come in here late at night or something like that. So we could see how I could become less productive. And essentially, again, what we want to do is we want to find the points where my marginal revenue is going to equal my marginal cost. I want to maximize my profit by choosing that output level. So the question becomes one of, how do we determine that? Well, what we know, just by the definition of what a marginal is that would be my change in revenue as I produce more. Sorry, that would be this equation. A change in my revenue as I produce more. But we see that for marginal cost, same thing. Change in my total costs as my quantity changes as well. We want to find where these two are equal. And what we're seeing is that these aren't constant numbers, that they are changing. Okay, so again, here's our marginal revenue, change in total revenue over change in total costs. Right? What? Oh, there's totally an error here. I didn't make these slides, the publisher did. Do you see the error? Look at that. Net total costs, change in quantity. So the question would be is what would happen? So if we know this is our goal, where the two are equal, what would we say at these situations? If I sold one more and I brought in more additional revenue than the costs were going out the door, then this firm would likely produce more, right? Because it's not that they'd be making a profit, it's just that, again, the amount of revenue coming in would be greater. So they would make more. And in this situation, if the revenue being brought in was less than the costs, then they would produce less. But here's the thing. But the act of making more raises the marginal cost. The act of making less lowers the marginal cost. So the marginal costs are changing here until they equal the marginal revenue. And so let's look at this situation where we're going to look at McDonald's here with the Big Mac. Okay, so we get our revenue, we've got our cost functions, and now we can see that as more Big Macs are produced, we can see how the revenue changes, and we can see how the cost change, and that change in the revenue would be 4, 4, 4. You get the hint here? 4, 4. At least in this situation, a Big Mac costs $4. So the marginal revenue here is not going to change at all. It's specifically for this case because we're presuming that the price is always staying the same, at least in this example. But now look at what's happening to the costs. Changing by 2, changing by 1, changing by 1, changing by 2, changing by 3, changing by 4, changing by 5, changing by 6, changing by 7, changing by 8. That's what appears right here. And so look what we do. We find the point where the marginal revenue is equal to the marginal cost. In this region here, they would produce more. Because here the marginal revenue is greater than the marginal costs. And here they would produce less. The marginal costs are greater than the marginal revenue. And we could graph it out, and it would look like this. And then essentially, again, what we see is that this isn't necessarily profits. So, just don't think of when marginal revenue is greater than marginal cost, that it's profit. But it does tell us a great deal about whether the firm should produce more, less, or should produce exactly that amount. Okay. The rest of these are to practice what you know, and so you can kind of look at those. And that wraps up this lecture.